The shovel hit something soft in the darkness. Karen Whitmore froze, her manicured hands trembling as she realized what she'd done. 3 feet down in the freshly dug hole behind the community garden, 17-year-old Marcus Chen lay unconscious, his wheelchair overturned beside him. She'd meant to teach the problem family a lesson about HOA violations, but her prank had gone horribly wrong. As sirens wailed in the distance and flashlights cut through the night, Karen faced a choice that would destroy everything she'd built and reveal a truth that would shake Willowbrook Estates to its thaw. Morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Willowbrook Estates, each blade of grass seemingly measured to regulation height. Karen Whitmore stood on her front porch, clipboard in hand, surveying her domain with the sharp eye of a general inspecting troops. At 43, she'd transformed herself from a desperate divorcee into the undisputed queen of suburban perfection, and she intended to keep it that way. "Another violation," she muttered, making a note as her gaze fixed on the Chen family's property across the street. The wooden ramp leading to their front door was exactly 3 inches too wide, according to the HOA guidelines she'd helped draft. More importantly, it was an eyesore that reminded everyone that Willowbrook wasn't quite as exclusive as she'd promised potential buyers. The sound of squeaking wheels drew her attention. Marcus Chen was navigating his wheelchair down the ramp, his mother Lisa following close behind with a worried expression. The 17-year-old had been paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident 2 years ago. But his spirit remained unbroken, something that irritated Karen more than she cared to admit. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Lisa Chen called out, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as one of them in Karen's mind. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Karen's smile was as artificial as the flowers in her front yard. "It certainly is, Mrs. Chen, though I'm afraid I'll need to speak with you about that ramp again. The board meeting is next week, and there have been complaints." Marcus rolled his wheelchair closer, his dark eyes flashing with anger. "Complaints about what?" "The fact that I can actually leave my house." Marcus's mother warned softly, but Karen saw the flash of defiance in the boy's expression. It reminded her uncomfortably of her own son at that age, before the accident that had taken him from her 5 years ago. "I understand this is difficult," Karen continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd perfected over years of HOA meetings. "But rules are rules. The aesthetic standards of our community are more important than basic human decency." Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "My mom saved for 3 years to afford this house after Dad died. We moved here because the realtor said it was wheelchair accessible. Now you want to trap me inside because my ramp is 3 inches too wide." Karen's jaw tightened. The boy had a point, but admitting that would undermine everything she'd built. "The regulations are clearly stated in the HOA covenant. Perhaps you should have read them more carefully before purchasing." "We did read them," Lisa said quietly. "The accessibility provisions were supposed to override aesthetic concerns. At least, that's what we were told. By whom?" Karen's voice turned sharp. She'd been meticulous about ensuring no exceptions were written into the covenants, even for disability accommodations. The last thing Willowbrook needed was to become known as a place for problem families. Marcus wheeled closer, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "What's your problem with us, lady? Are you just a control freak, or is there something else going on here?" The question hit too close to home. Karen's own son had been disabled too, confined to a wheelchair after a diving accident at age 15. She'd fought every day to give him a normal life, to pretend everything was fine, until the depression had taken him away from her permanently. Looking at Marcus now, she saw everything she'd tried to forget: the daily struggles, the stares, the pity. "My problem," she said coldly, "is that some people seem to think they're above the rules that keep our community beautiful and our property values high. The board will be voting on your ramp next Thursday. I suggest you make alternative arrangements." As she turned to go back inside, Marcus called out, "You know what? I'll be at that meeting, and I'll bring everyone in this neighborhood who's tired of your bullying." Karen paused on her doorstep, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the handle. "Good luck with that, young man. But remember, I've been running this board for 8 years. I know exactly how to handle troublemakers." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud as she disappeared inside, leaving the Chen family standing in the growing heat of the morning sun. That evening, Karen sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by HOA documents and legal precedents. Her phone buzzed with text messages from other board members, each one more concerning than the last. Word was spreading about Marcus's planned appearance at the meeting, and several residents were expressing sympathy for the family's situation. "Is exactly what I was afraid of," she muttered, scrolling through the messages. "Give them an inch, and they'll take a mile." Her phone rang, and she recognized the number of Brad Morrison, the HOA board treasurer and her closest ally. "Karen, we need to talk. I've been getting calls all day about this ramp situation. It's a clear violation. Brad, the covenants are explicit. Maybe, but the optics are terrible. A disabled kid fighting for accessibility. The local news would have a field day if this gets out." Karen's blood ran cold. Media attention was the last thing she needed. "It won't get out. I'll handle it."
"How?"
Half the board is already wavering. Janet Reeves thinks we should grant an exception, and you know how she influences the others. "Leave Janet to me," Karen said, her mind already working through possibilities. "And Brad, not a word about this to anyone else. We handle this internally." After hanging up, Karen poured herself a glass of wine and stood by her window, watching the Chen house across the street. Light glowed warmly from their windows, and she could see the family moving about, living their lives, disrupting her carefully constructed world. She thought about her own son, David, and how different things might have been if she'd been stronger. Back then, if she'd fought harder against the depression that had consumed him, if she'd been less concerned about appearances and more focused on what really mattered. But that was the past. This was about the future of Willowbrook Estates, and she wouldn't let one family's problems drag down everything she'd built. The next morning brought rain, turning the perfect lawns into muddy obstacles. Karen watched from her kitchen window. As Marcus struggled to navigate his wheelchair across the wet pavement, his mother hurrying to help him. The sight should have inspired sympathy, but instead, it reinforced her conviction that disabled families simply didn't belong in a community like theirs. Her phone rang again this time. It was Janet Reeves, the HOA secretary, and her biggest obstacle on the board. "Karen, I've been thinking about the Chen situation. Maybe we should consider Janet. We've been through this. The covenants are clear, but the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't override private property agreements. I've already consulted with our attorney." There was a long pause. On the other end of the line, "Karen, I'm going to be honest with you. This doesn't feel right. That boy has been through enough, and forcing his family to tear down their ramp is exactly what we'd do for any other violation." Karen interrupted. "We can't make exceptions based on emotions. It's not about emotions, it's about basic human decency." Karen's grip tightened on the phone. "If you're not prepared to enforce the covenants we all agreed to, maybe you should consider stepping down from the board." The threat was clear, and both women knew it. Karen had enough influence to make Janet's life in Willowbrook very difficult. If she chose to oppose her, "I'll see you at the meeting," Janet said quietly, and hung up. Karen smiled grimly. Another problem solved through careful application of pressure. It was amazing how quickly people backed down when they realized what they had to lose, but her satisfaction was short. As she watched the Chen family prepare to leave their house, Marcus, struggling with his wheelchair on the wet ramp, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small camera, barely visible, was mounted under the eaves of their house pointed. Directly at her property, they were recording her, documenting her actions, building a case against her. The thought filled her with rage and a familiar sense of panic. She'd worked too hard to build her reputation, to establish herself as the guardian of Willowbrook's standards, to let a disabled teenager tear it all down. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. She called Brad Morrison and arranged a meeting for that evening, not at the community center, but at the construction site behind the neighborhood where they were building new houses. It was time to send a message that the Chen family would understand perfectly. "What exactly are you planning?" Brad asked when they met in the gathering dusk. "Nothing illegal," Karen replied, though the shovel in her hand suggested otherwise. "Just a little demonstration of what happens when people don't respect the community standards. Karen, this is crazy. If you get caught, I won't get caught. And after tonight, Marcus Chen will understand exactly." The storm hit Willowbrook Estates with unexpected fury, transforming the manicured streets into rivers of mud and debris. Karen Whitmore stood in the construction site behind the neighborhood, rain plastering her hair against her skull as she gripped the shovel with white-knuckled determination. The hole she'd been digging was now 3 feet deep and growing, each strike of the blade against the soggy earth echoing her mounting desperation. "This is insane, Karen," Brad Morrison shouted over the thunder, his expensive suit soaked through. "We need to get out of here before someone sees us." Karen didn't stop digging. The plan had seemed so simple when she'd conceived it that afternoon: create a construction accident that would serve as a warning to the Chen family. Dig a hole, cover it with plywood and debris, let Marcus discover it when he came snooping around. A scare tactic to show him what happened when people didn't respect the natural order of things. But now, standing in the pouring rain with mud caked under her fingernails, the plan felt like madness. Still, she couldn't stop. The image of Marcus Chun's defiant face, the camera mounted under their eaves, the threat to everything she'd built, it all drove her forward with mechanical precision. "Just help me get the plywood in place," she gasped, throwing another shovelful of earth. 10 more minutes, and we're done." Brad backed away, his face pale in the intermittent lightning. "I'm not doing this. I'm going home, and if you have any sense left, you'll do the same." "You're just going to abandon me? After everything I've done for this community? I'm trying to save you from yourself." Brad turned and started walking toward his car, parked behind a pile of construction materials. "This isn't about the community anymore, Karen. This is about whatever's eating you alive inside." Karen watched him disappear into the storm, leaving her alone with the growing hole and her spiraling thoughts. The rain was making the sides of the pit unstable, mud sliding down. To partially fill what she'd already dug, she needed to finish quickly, get the plywood cover in place, and retreat to the safety of her perfect house. But as she bent to resume digging, she heard something that made her blood freeze: the distinctive squeak of wheelchair wheels on wet pavement. Marcus Chen was coming. She'd expected him to investigate eventually, but not tonight, not in this storm. Panic flooded through her as she realized the trap wasn't ready. The hole was too deep, the plywood wasn't positioned correctly, and there was nowhere for her to hide. The construction site was an open field, dotted with equipment and material, piles offering little concealment. The squeaking grew closer, accompanied by the splash of wheels through puddles. Karen grabbed the plywood sheet she'd brought and tried to drag it over the hole. But the wood was heavy and awkward, made worse by the rain. Her hand slipped on the wet surface, and the board crashed down at an angle, partially covering the pit but leaving a dangerous gap. "Hello!" Marcus's voice carried clearly through the rain. "Is someone out there?" Karen crouched behind a pile of concrete blocks, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gaps in the materials, she could see Marcus's silhouette approaching, his wheelchair navigating the muddy terrain with practiced skill. What was he doing here? How had he known to come? The answer came as he called out again, "I saw the lights from my bedroom window. Brad Morrison's car is still here, so I know someone's around." Of course, Brad's silver Mercedes was parked in plain sight, a beacon advertising their presence. Karen cursed silently as she watched Marcus's wheel closer to the construction area, his head turning as he scanned the site. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus called, his voice carrying a note of certainty now. "I know you're here. What are you doing?" Karen's mind raced. She could try to bluff, claim she was investigating vandalism or checking on the construction progress, but the shovel in her hands and the freshly dug hole would be impossible to explain. The smart thing would be to reveal herself, fabricate some excuse, and end this before it spiraled further out of control. Instead, she remained frozen behind the concrete blocks, watching as Marcus rolled directly toward the camouflaged pit. "This is crazy," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "Coming out here in this weather just because I thought I saw a..." His words cut off as his front wheels hit the edge of the plywood. The board, improperly balanced and slick with rain, tilted sharply downward. Marcus tried to brake, but the momentum of his chair carried him forward as the plywood gave way completely. Karen watched in horror as Marcus and his wheelchair tumbled into the hole she'd dug. The crash was sickening metal against earth, followed by a sharp cry of pain that was quickly muffled by the storm. Then silence. She remained crouched behind the concrete for several long moments, her mind struggling to process what had happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hole was meant to be a warning, a scare tactic, not a trap that would actually hurt someone. Finally, she forced herself to move, crawling forward on her hands and knees until she could peer over the edge of the pit. Marcus lay at the bottom, his wheelchair overturned beside him, one wheel still spinning slowly. His eyes were closed, and she could see blood on his forehead where he'd struck something during the fall. "Marcus," she whispered, then louder, "Marcus." No response. The boy was unconscious, possibly seriously injured, lying in 3 feet of muddy water at the bottom of a hole she'd dug. Karen's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis as the full magnitude of what she'd done crashed over her dot. She had to get him out. Had to call for help. Had the sound of sirens in the distance made her freeze. Someone had called the police, probably when they'd noticed the lights at the construction site. Or maybe Lisa Chen had realized her son was missing and raised. The alarm dot, Karen looked down at Marcus's still form, then at the shovel in her hands, then at the approaching lights visible through the storm. In that moment, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could stay, help extract Marcus from the hole, and face the consequences of her actions. Admit that her harassment of the Chen family had escalated into something monstrous. Accept that her reputation, her position, her carefully crafted life would be destroyed. Or she could run. The sirens were getting closer now, their wail cutting through the storm like a knife. Karen looked one more time at Marcus's unconscious form, then made a decision that would haunt her forever. She grabbed the shovel and began to fill in the hole. The first shovelful of mud landed on Marcus's legs. The second hit his overturned wheelchair. Karen worked with mechanical precision, her mind detached from the horror of what she was doing. She wasn't burying a 17-year-old boy, she was solving a problem, eliminating evidence, protecting everything she'd built. The mud was heavy and wet, making the work exhausting. Her designer clothes were ruined, her manicured nails broken and bleeding. But she kept digging, kept filling, as the sirens grew louder and the storm raged around. Her dot, she was halfway done when Marcus stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. He tried to sit up, but the weight of the mud on his legs held him down. When he looked up and saw Karen standing over him with the shovel, his expression shifted from confusion to pure terror. "What are you doing?" he gasped, spitting mud from his mouth. "Help me, please." Karen paused, shovel raised, looking down at the boy she'd grown to hate. His face was streaked with mud and blood, his dark eyes wide with fear and pain. For a moment, she saw her own son in that expression, David, trapped in his own despair, begging for help she hadn't been able to give. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether she was speaking to Marcus or to David's memory, she wasn't sure. "Do this," Marcus pleaded, trying to drag himself upward through the mud. "My mom, ... she needs me. I'm all she has left." The words cut through Karen's dissociation like a blade. Lisa Chen would lose her son, just as Karen had lost hers. The parallel was so stark, so perfectly cruel, that for a moment she almost dropped the shovel. Almost instead, she raised it higher and brought it down hard against Marcus's temple. The boy's eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious once. More into the muddy water dot, Karen resumed her work with frantic energy. The sirens were very close. Now she could see the flash of red and blue lights through the trees. She had maybe 2 minutes before they arrived, maybe less. She threw shovelful after shovelful of earth and mud into the hole. Watching as Marcus's form disappeared beneath the surface, first his legs, then his torso, then his arms. Soon only, his head remained visible, tilted at an awkward angle. His face pale and slack, the last shovelful covered his features completely. Karen stood over the filled-in hole, breathing hard, her entire body shaking. The construction site looked normal. Now, another patch of muddy ground among many. The wheelchair had disappeared entirely, along with any evidence that Marcus Chen had ever been there. She was turning to leave when she heard "Edalo," mechanical whine that made her blood freeze. Somewhere under the mud, Marcus's phone was vibrating. Someone was calling him. Karen dropped to her knees and began digging frantically with her hands, trying to locate the sound. But the mud was thick and heavy, and the vibrating stopped before she could find it. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. The police cars were in the construction site now, their headlights cutting through the storm. Karen could hear voices, see shapes. Mo, Part 3. The unraveling the excavation lights turned the construction site into a harsh, alien landscape. Karen Whitmore sat in the back of a police cruiser, her mud-caked hands cuffed behind her back, watching as the rescue team worked frantically to uncover what she'd buried. Each shovelful of earth they removed felt like another layer of her soul being stripped away. "How long has he been down there?" Detective Sarah Martinez asked, her voice cutting through the chaos outside. She'd arrived 20 minutes ago, taking charge of the scene with the efficient brutality of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. Karen couldn't answer, the words stuck in her throat like concrete. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched as the paramedics finally reached Marcus Chin's body. His face was gray-blue in the harsh lights, mud-caked in his hair and clothing. They were performing CPR, their movements urgent and mechanical. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martinez pressed, sliding into the seat beside her. "I need you to focus. Every second counts here." "How long was he buried?" "I don't know," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe ... maybe 10 minutes. 15. It was a lie." She knew exactly how long it had been. 23 minutes since she'd thrown the last shovelful of earth over Marcus's face. 23 minutes of oxygen deprivation, of crushing weight pressing down on his chest, of mud filling his lungs. 23 minutes that might have already killed him. Why? Martinez's question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything Karen had destroyed. "Why would you do this to a kid?" Karen turned away from the window, unable to watch the rescue efforts any longer. "You don't understand. He was threatening everything we'd built, the community, the property values, the standards we'd worked so hard to maintain. So you decided to bury him alive?" The words hit like a physical blow. Karen had been telling herself it was an accident, a scare tactic gone wrong. But hearing it stated so baldly, so accurately, shattered her remaining delusions. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, tears finally coming. "I just wanted him to understand his place." Martinez leaned back, studying Karen's face with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Tell me about your son. Died by suicide 5 years ago. Also in a wheelchair after a diving accident? You want to tell me there's no connection here?" The detective's words opened a wound that had never properly healed. Karen felt the familiar spiral of grief and guilt, threatening to pull her under. That's not relevant, isn't it? You see this kid Marcus fighting for his rights, being supported by his community. And what? You're jealous. Angry that he's getting the help your son never got. "Stop!" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "Or maybe you're angry at yourself. Maybe seeing Marcus reminds you of all the ways you failed David, all the times you chose appearances over his needs." I said stop, but Martinez wasn't finished. "I've been reading the reports. Your son tried to kill himself twice before he succeeded. Both times, you had him transferred to private facilities outside the community. Couldn't have the neighbors knowing that perfect Karen Whitmore's perfect family was falling apart?" Karen doubled over as if she'd been punched. The truth of it was like acid in her veins. She had prioritized appearances over David's needs, had been more concerned with maintaining her image than getting him the help he desperately needed. And when he'd finally succeeded in taking his own life, she'd thrown herself into controlling Willowbrook estates with the same obsessive energy she'd once used to hide his problems. "You're wrong," she gasped, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. Outside, the paramedics were loading Marcus onto a stretcher. An oxygen mask covered his face, and she could see the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, but barely. The mud had done its damage. She could see it in the urgent way the medical team was working, the speed with which they loaded him into the ambulance. "He's going to survive," Martinez said, following her gaze. "But the doctors aren't sure about brain damage, yet depends on how long he was without oxygen." Karen felt something break inside her chest. Is he going to be okay? That depends on a lot of things. His age, his overall health, how quickly we found him. But Mrs. Whitmore, even if he makes a full recovery, what you did tonight crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The detectives? Phone buzzed, and she stepped out of the cruiser to take the call. Through the window, Karen could see the crime scene team photographing everything: the shovel, the disturbed earth, the tire tracks from Marcus's wheelchair, building a case that would destroy what remained of her life. But as she watched, something else caught her attention. Lisa Chen had arrived, her face a mask of terror and rage as she ran toward the ambulance. Karen could see her mouth moving, could imagine her desperate questions about her son's condition. The sight was like looking into a mirror of her own past to another mother facing the possible loss of her child. Another family torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. The difference was that Lisa Chen's nightmare was entirely Karen's fault. Martinez returned to the cruiser, her expression grim. That was the hospital. Marcus is in critical condition. Severe oxygen deprivation, possible brain swelling. They're taking him into surgery now. Karen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a shroud. I want to confess. I want to tell you everything. You sure about that? Once you start talking, there's no taking it back, I'm sure. Karen looked up at the detective, her face streaked with tears and mud. But first, I need to know something. How did you find him so quickly? I thought I'd covered it up completely. Martinez smiled grimly. You did a good job covering the whole, but you forgot about the wheelchair tracks in the mud. Marcus's chair has a distinctive tread pattern custom wheels his mother bought him. For better traction, we followed the tracks right to the burial site. The irony was crushing. The same accessibility modifications that Karen had tried to eliminate from the neighborhood had ultimately saved Marcus's life. His mother's love and attention to his needs had provided the clue that led to his rescue. There's something else, Martinez continued. The camera mounted under the Chen family's roof. It's been recording everything. Your midnight meetings with Brad Morrison, your surveillance of their property, your increasingly erratic behavior over the past month. We have it all. Karen's remaining hope crumbled. How long have you been watching me? Since last week, when Marcus filed a complaint about harassment. The kid was smart. He documented everything. Every violation notice, every hostile encounter. Every threat you made. He was building a case against you even before tonight. The revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been a victim, he'd been fighting back, using the same systematic approach she'd employed against his family. The hunted had become the hunter, and she'd been too blinded by her own obsessions to see it. I want to make a statement, she said quietly. I want to tell you exactly what happened and why. Martinez nodded and activated a recording device. Karen Whitmore, you've been read your rights. You've waived your right to an attorney. Is that correct? Yes. Tell me what happened tonight. Karen took a deep breath and began to speak. She told Martinez everything, the plan to scare Marcus, the hole she'd dug, the moment when everything went wrong. She described the panic that had overtaken her, the decision to bury him rather than face the consequences of her actions. But as she talked, she found herself going deeper, exploring the wounds that had driven her to this point. She spoke about David, about the guilt and grief that had consumed her after his death. She talked about her need to control everything around her, to create the perfect community that might somehow make up for the perfect family she'd failed to preserve. I see him everywhere, she said, her voice breaking. Every time I look at Marcus, I see David, and I hate him for it. I hate that he's alive when my son is dead. I hate that his mother is fighting for him when I couldn't fight for mine. I hate that he's everything David could have been if I'd been a better mother. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting Karen pour out the poison that had been building in her system for years. When she was finished, the detective turned off the recording device and sat back. That's quite a story, she said. But you know what? None of it excuses what you did tonight. Marcus Chen isn't responsible for your son's death. His mother isn't responsible for your failures. And your grief doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's lives. Karen nodded, feeling empty and hollow. I know. I know that now. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent 5 years turning your pain into a weapon. You used your position on the HOA board to hurt people who reminded you of your own failures. You targeted the Chen family specifically because they represented everything you couldn't be. The accusation was accurate and devastating. Karen had weaponized her grief, had turned her community leadership role into a platform for acting out her own psychological damage. She'd hurt innocent people because she couldn't bear to face her own guilt. What happens now? She asked. Now you go to jail. You'll be charged with attempted murder, assault, criminal confinement, and probably a dozen other felonies. If Marcus dies, The fluorescent lights in the county jail's interrogation room buzzed with the persistence of dying insects. Karen Whitmore sat across from her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Vance, who'd been assigned to her case when she couldn't afford private counsel. The media attention had been swift and brutal by morning. Every asset Karen owned had been frozen, pending the civil lawsuit Lisa Chen had filed against her. "The prosecution is offering a plea deal," Vance said, sliding a document across the scarred metal table. "Attempted murder in the second degree, aggravated assault, criminal confinement, 25 years, eligible for parole in 15. Karen stared at the papers without seeing them. "What about Marcus? How is he alive?" "But, double quotes," Vance hesitated. "The oxygen deprivation caused significant brain damage. He's awake, but he's lost most of his speech and motor function. The doctors say he'll need full-time care for the rest of his life." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She'd destroyed not just Marcus's body, but his mind, the brilliant, defiant intellect that had challenged her authority and exposed her cruelty. The boy who'd been fighting for his rights would now struggle to form coherent sentences. His mother, Karen asked quietly. "Lisa Chen is. She's not doing well. She's had to quit her job to care for Marcus full-time. The medical bills are astronomical, and the insurance company is fighting coverage because they claim the injuries resulted from a criminal act." Karen closed her eyes, seeing Lisa's face in her mind. Another mother whose life had been shattered, whose child had been stolen from her not by death, but by something arguably worse. Marcus was alive, but the boy he'd been was gone forever. "There's something else," Vance continued. "The HOA board voted to dissolve itself completely. They're restructuring the entire community covenant system from scratch. Your ... actions have basically torn apart everything you spent years building." The irony wasn't lost on Karen. In trying to preserve her perfect community, she'd destroyed it entirely. The residents of Willowbrook Estates were now united in their horror at what she'd done, their shame at having enabled her behavior for so long. What about Brad Morrison, the other board members? Morrison's cooperating fully with the investigation. He's facing charges for conspiracy and accessory, but his lawyer thinks he'll get probation. The others claim they had no knowledge of your ... escalation. Karen almost laughed at the euphemism, escalation, as if burying a teenager alive was just the next logical step in a neighborhood dispute. "I want to see him," she said suddenly. "Marcus. I want to see what I did to him." Vance looked uncomfortable. That's not possible. The Chen family has a restraining order against you, and frankly, it wouldn't be advisable for your case. The jury is going to see enough evidence of the damage you caused." "I don't care about my case. I want to see him." "Karen, listen to me. The prosecutor is pushing for life without parole. The only thing standing between you and dying in prison is this plea agreement. Don't do anything that might jeopardize it." But Karen was no longer listening. She was thinking about David, about the visits to his hospital room after his suicide attempts, how she'd sat beside his bed making promises about getting him help, about fighting for him, about putting his needs first. Promises she'd never kept. "I want to plead guilty," she said, "to everything. No deal, no bargaining. I want to plead guilty and throw myself on the mercy of the court." Vance stared at her. "That's suicide. With a guilty plea to attempted murder, you're looking at life in prison, maybe even the death penalty." "This is a hate crime, Karen. You targeted Marcus because of his disability." "Good," Karen said quietly. "Maybe that's what I deserve." The courtroom was packed on the day of Karen's sentencing. She'd refused all plea deals, insisted on pleading guilty to every charge, and waived her right to a jury trial. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, had reluctantly accepted the guilty plea after ensuring Karen understood the consequences. Lisa Chen sat in the front row, her face a mask of controlled fury. Beside her, in a specialized wheelchair, was Marcus. The sight of him made Karen's breath catch in her throat. The vital, defiant teenager was gone, replaced by a pale shadow who stared blankly ahead with unfocused eyes. A feeding tube snaked from his nose, and his head lolled to one side, supported by a specialized headrest. Marcus Chen was 17 years old, Prosecutor Janet Mills said, addressing the court. He was an honor student, a volunteer at the local animal shelter, and an advocate for disability rights. He had dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer, of fighting for people like himself, who faced discrimination and prejudice. Karen forced herself to look at Marcus as the prosecutor spoke. His mother was holding his hand, speaking softly to him, but there was no recognition in his eyes. The boy who'd challenged her authority, who'd planned to confront her at the HOA meeting, was gone. The defendant didn't just try to kill Marcus Chen, Mills continued. She tried to erase him, to literally bury him because his existence threatened her vision of what her community should be. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a calculated act of hatred against a disabled child. When it came time for victim impact statements, Lisa Chen rose slowly to her feet. She was thinner than Karen remembered, her face aged by months of stress and grief. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but filled with a pain that cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Marcus was my miracle," she said. "After the accident that paralyzed him, the doctor said he might never walk again. But Marcus said that it was okay, he'd find other ways to move through the world. He taught himself to advocate for accessibility, to fight for other disabled kids who didn't have his advantages." She paused, looking directly at Karen for the first time. "You took that away from him. You took his voice, his independence, his future. You turned my brilliant, beautiful son into someone who can't even recognize his own mother some days." Lisa's composure cracked slightly. "But you know what? Marcus is still fighting. Even now, even damaged as he is, he's still fighting. The doctors say he shouldn't be aware of his surroundings, but sometimes I catch him listening when I read to him. Sometimes I see a spark of the boy he was." She turned back to the judge. "I don't want revenge. I want justice. I want this woman to understand that she didn't just attack my son, she attacked every parent who's ever fought for their disabled child. Every person who's ever faced discrimination because they're different." When Lisa sat down, the courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of crying from the gallery. Karen realized that many of the faces in the audience were familiar neighbors from Willowbrook Estates, people she'd once considered friends. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom emptied, with her thoughts through the window, she could see the city beyond, life continuing as if nothing had happened. Children playing in parks, families walking together, the ordinary miracle of people living their lives without the weight of having destroyed someone else's. When court reconvened, Karen stood to address the judge. She'd prepared a statement. But looking at Marcus and his mother, the words seemed inadequate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't explain what I did. I can't justify it or make it make sense. I was angry and bitter, and I let my pain turn into something poisonous." She looked directly at Lisa Chen. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, that it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry. Your son didn't deserve what I did to him. No one deserves that." Karen's voice broke. "I lost my own son 5 years ago. He was disabled too, and I failed him. I failed him in every way that mattered. And when I saw Marcus, when I saw how much you loved him, how you fought for him, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand seeing you be the mother I never was." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Karen had finally spoken the truth that had been eating at her for years, that her hatred of Marcus had been born from her own self-hatred, her own guilt over David's death. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued. "I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I see him now. I see Marcus for who he really is, not a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated, but a human being with value and worth and the right to exist in this world." She sat down, emotionally exhausted. Judge Hendricks studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Karen Whitmore, you have pleaded guilty to attempted murder, aggravated assault, criminal confinement, and hate crime enhancement. The court has reviewed your case extensively, and I must say, this is one of the most disturbing crimes I've encountered in 20 years on the bench." The judge's voice was stern but not unkind. "You held a position of trust in your community. You were supposed to protect and serve the residents of Willowbrook Estates. Instead, you used your authority to target and terrorize a disabled child and his family." Karen felt the weight of every word. "However, I also recognize that you have taken full responsibility for your actions. You've shown genuine remorse, and you've waived your right to appeal. These factors, while they don't excuse your crimes, do speak to your character." Judge Hendricks paused, consulting her notes. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence at the maximum security women's facility, and you will be required to PE. 3 years after the sentencing, Willowbrook Estates looked nothing like the pristine suburban paradise Karen Whitmore had once ruled. The rigid aesthetic standards had been replaced with something warmer, more human. Wheelchair ramps dotted the sidewalks, gardens bloomed in previously forbidden colors, and children's toys scattered across lawns that no longer had to be regulation height. At the center of it all stood the Marcus Chen Community Center, built on the exact spot where the construction site had once been. The building was fully accessible, designed by architects who specialized in universal design principles. A bronze plaque by the entrance bore Marcus's senior portrait, the image of a bright, determined young man whose dreams had been stolen, but whose legacy lived on. Inside the center, Lisa Chen worked at her desk in the advocacy office she'd established with the settlement money from Karen's conviction. The irony wasn't lost on her. Karen's cruelty had funded the very programs she'd tried to destroy. The center now served as a model for disability rights advocacy across the state, offering legal aid, support services, and community education. Mom, the voice was halting, unclear, but unmistakably Marcus's. Lisa looked up to see her son being wheeled into the office by his aide, a young woman named Sarah, who'd been working with him for the past year. Marcus's condition had stabilized. Somewhat he'd regained limited speech and some motor function, though he would never again be the eloquent advocate he'd once been. "Hi, sweetheart," Lisa said, rising to kiss his forehead. "How was therapy?" "Today?" hard Marcus managed, the single word requiring visible effort. But ... good. It had taken him 2 years to speak his first word after the attack, another year to form simple sentences. The doctors called it miraculous. But Lisa knew it was something else. It was Marcus's indomitable will, the same spirit that had led him to challenge Karen's authority in the first place. "We have visitors coming today," Lisa told him gently. "Some students from the law school. They want to learn about advocacy work." Marcus's eyes brightened slightly. Despite his limitations, he still understood the importance of education, of passing on knowledge to the next generation. He couldn't be the civil rights lawyer he'd dreamed of becoming, but his story was teaching others to take up that fight. The law students arrived an hour later, diverse group of young people who handled Marcus's condition with the casual acceptance of a generation raised on disability awareness. They listened intently as Lisa explained the legal ramifications of the case, how it had led to stronger hate crime legislation and new protections for disabled individuals facing housing discrimination. The hardest part, Lisa told them, wasn't the physical recovery or even the legal battle. It was learning to live with hatred, understanding that someone could look at my son and see him as less than human. One of the students, a young woman with bright eyes and a determined expression that reminded Lisa painfully of Marcus before the attack, raised her hand. "How do you forgive something like that? How do you move forward?" Lisa glanced at Marcus, who was listening with the focused attention that had become his trademark since the injury. Despite everything, he'd retained his ability to absorb information, to understand complex concepts, even if he couldn't express them clearly. "I don't know if I have forgiven her," Lisa admitted, "but I've learned that carrying hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Karen Whitmore destroyed my son's future, but I wasn't going to let her destroy mine too." "What about justice?" another student asked. "Do you feel like the system worked?" "Karen got life." "In prison," Lisa replied, "she'd die behind bars, and that feels appropriate, given what she tried to do. But real justice isn't just punishment, it's prevention. It's building a world where what happened to Marcus can't happen to other families." As the students took notes, Lisa's mind drifted to the letters she'd been receiving for the past year. Letters from prison, written in Karen's careful handwriting, each one an attempt at apology and explanation. Lisa had read every one, but never responded. What was there to say to the woman who'd buried her son alive? The latest letter had been different, though. Karen had written about a program she'd started in prison, teaching literacy to women who'd never learned to read. She'd described it as her attempt to give something back, to create rather than destroy. The letter had ended with a simple statement: "I know I can never undo what I did, but I'm trying to become someone who might have been worthy of Marcus's forgiveness." Lisa had thrown that letter away like all the others, but the words had stayed. With her, maybe redemption was possible, even for someone who'd committed the unforgivable. Maybe the human capacity for change was stronger than the human capacity for cruelty after the students left. Lisa sat with Marcus in the center's main room, watching through the large windows as children played in the accessible playground outside. The laughter and joy were a stark contrast to the sterile perfection that had once defined Willowbrook Estates. "Do you remember her?" Lisa asked quietly. "Karen Whitmore." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his damaged brain working to process the question. When he finally spoke, his words were halting but clear. "Remember? Angry lady, but not angry." "Any more?" Lisa looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" She was hurt. Like me. Different hurt, but Marcus struggled with the words, his face scrunched in concentration. She lost her boy too. The insight was devastating in its simplicity. Even with his cognitive limitations, Marcus had grasped something that had taken Lisa years to understand, that Karen's cruelty had been born from grief, that her attack on him had been an expression of her own psychological wounds. "Do you think she can get better?" Lisa asked. "Like you're getting better?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Everyone, can get better. Takes time. Takes work." His words hung in the air as Lisa contemplated their meaning. Here was her son, brain damaged, and permanently disabled because of Karen's actions, suggesting that even his attacker deserved the chance at healing. It was either the wisdom of someone who'd survived the unthinkable, or the naivety of a mind that could no longer fully grasp the complexity of human evil. Maybe both. That evening, Lisa sat at her kitchen table with a blank piece of paper. Before her, for 3 years, she'd ignored Karen's letters, had refused to acknowledge the woman's existence. But Marcus's words had planted a seed of something she wasn't ready to call forgiveness, but which felt like the first step toward peace. She began to write: "Mrs. Whitmore, I received your letters. All of them. I want you to know that I read every word, even though I never responded. I want you to understand what your actions cost our family. Not just the immediate damage, but the ongoing consequences we live with every day." Lisa paused, her pen hovering over the paper. What came next? Anger, condemnation. Surprisingly, she found herself writing something else entirely. "Marcus asked about you today. He said you were hurt too, that you lost your son. I don't know if that excuses what you did. Don't think anything. Could excuse it, but I'm beginning to understand that hurt people hurt people. And maybe the cycle only stops when someone chooses to step outside of it." She wrote about Marcus's progress, about the center that bore his name, about the legislation that had passed in response to his case. She described the community that had grown up around his advocacy, the families who'd found support and resources they desperately needed. "You tried to bury my son because you couldn't stand what he represented: hope, resilience, the possibility of building something better from tragedy. But Marcus is still here, still fighting in his own way, and every day that he continues to exist, to learn, to grow, despite what you did to him, is a testament to the fact that love is stronger than hatred." Lisa signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope before she could change her mind. She wasn't sure what response she expected, or if she even wanted one. But she knew that carrying the weight of Karen's crimes was slowly poisoning her own ability to heal. The letter would reach Karen in 3 days, arriving at the maximum security facility where she'd been serving her sentence. Karen would read it in her small cell, surrounded by the gray walls that had become her world. And for the first time in 3 years, she would cry, not from self-pity, but from something approaching gratitude. Because Lisa Chen had given her something she'd thought was lost forever: the possibility that she might still be human enough to deserve a second chance at becoming someone better. The cycle of hatred that had begun with David Whitmore's death and reached its terrible climax in Marcus. Chen's attack was finally beginning to break, not through revenge or punishment, but through the radical act of one mother refusing to let another mother's cruelty define the rest of her life. In Willowbrook Estates, children played on accessible playgrounds while their parents watched from ramps and walkways designed for everyone. The perfect neighborhood was gone, replaced by something messier but infinitely more beautiful: a community built on inclusion rather than exclusion, on love rather than fear. And in a prison cell 3 states away, Karen Whitmore began the long, difficult work of learning to live with what she'd done and finding ways to honor the boy she'd tried to destroy. It would take the rest of her life, and it would never be enough to balance the scales of justice. But it was a B,